Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bernhard von der Planitz, Senior Counselor of the American Academy, and Steven Steinberg asked me to fill in for him. He is abroad, I think he's in the United States, and he asked me to fill in for him and to welcome all of you. A particular welcome goes to our speaker tonight, our Mr. Thomas Chatterton Williams. He is a Holtzbrinck Fellow, one of the two Holtzbrinck Fellows we have right now here in the Academy. The Holtzbrinck program has been started, I think, in 1999 with the generous support of the Holtzbrinck Verlagsgruppe, and it is intended to promote the dialogue, the German-American dialogue in the field of journalism, fiction, and nonfiction. So we have you here, and we're all looking very much forward to your presentation. But before I give you the floor, I would like to welcome James Angelus. James Angelus is a friend of our speaker of today. He is a fellow writer and, as I said, a good friend. And he is going to say a few words about our speaker today. So I would like to come and make your presentation. After the talk, the two will meet on the podium and will discuss the talk. And after that, the floor will be open for all of you. And after that, we'll all meet next door, continue our discussion, and can expect some little surprises from the wine cellar of the American Academy. Thank you very much.
Hello, good evening. It's an honor to be able to introduce Thomas Chatterton Williams, a fellow journalist and a friend. Thomas and I met a decade ago while we were in different graduate school programs in New York City. Thomas was the first person in our circle of fledgling journalists that I knew to obtain the coveted book deal, which at that point in life we all considered a form of professional nirvana, a kind of peak you reach at some illustrious stage in your career, and we'd barely begun. Thomas, however, seemed to turn that notion on its head, getting his first book deal from Penguin Press pretty much after writing just one article. An op-ed in the Washington Post. And even before getting his master's degree from the Cultural Reporting and Criticism program at New York University. This, of course, made my circle of fledgling journalist friends jealous. Really jealous. Rumors of the size of the advance swept the halls of NYU and Columbia journalism schools. But envy wasn't the only reaction to the news. Thomas's good fortune served as a bit of inspiration, too, allowing us to think that perhaps the accomplishments we sought weren't distant abstractions, but attainable much more immediately if we could muster the requisite confidence. Thomas's writing has since been published in a number of respected publications: New York Times, The New Yorker, N+1, the London Review of Books, The Nation, the Virginia Quarterly Review, to name some of them. That first book, his memoir, published in 2010, entitled Losing My Cool, was about what it was like for him growing up as a mixed-race kid in New Jersey, and about what he saw as the negative effect that hip-hop music had, the hip-hop music he listened to had on him at some points in his life. The book was praised for some beautiful writing, but for its criticism of hip-hop, it was controversial too. I think sometimes for Thomas, even some of the praise he got for the book wasn't always particularly easy to digest, at least when that praise came from conservatives who Thomas doesn't tend to see as his natural intellectual allies, putting him in what he felt to be strange company. But that leads me to one characteristic you ought to know about Thomas. His writing is courageous. He is not drawn to controversy for the sake of controversy itself, but because I think he is guided by an earnest intellectual search. After thinking about an issue, he ends up where he ends up on it, even if that place is hard to categorize, or unpopular, or uncomfortable. Irrespective of what you might think about some of the conclusions Thomas draws in his book or in some of the essays he's since written, I think I think his approach to his work, his honesty and his courage are worthy of admiration. After Thomas wrote the book, he moved to Paris, met Valentine, his lovely partner in life, and now the mother of his beautiful daughter, Marlow, and eventually started writing about new subjects, everything from race in America, terrorism in France, to a Texas law school student behind a movement to make 3D printed guns. After he moved to Paris, it's not so much that his voice as a writer began to change, but that he expanded his range and his ability to apply that voice. Anyone who read his piece in this week's New Yorker about how white supremacists in the United States are using the ideas of the new right in France, or who read his recent profile of Spike Lee in the New York Times Magazine, will notice Thomas's impressive capacity to work not only as an essayist, but also as a long-form magazine reporter in the strict sense of that word, reporter, sometimes fusing those two genres together into a single piece. That kind of expanding range, I think, illustrates Thomas's gifts and versatility as a writer and a thinker. Thomas is now writing his next book, which he's working on here at as a Holtzbrinck Fellow. The idea for the book emerged from an essay he wrote for the Virginia Quarterly Review titled Black and Blue and Blood. The essay ended up being selected by Jonathan Franzen for inclusion into the Best American Essays series in 2016. Like much of Thomas's work, the essay is deeply personal, and he describes his emotional reaction to the birth of his daughter. And again, reading it, you get a real sense that he's taking us with him on an honest, free search that is at the same time intellectually rigorous and powerfully emotional. As he seeks to understand his own identity and to answer a larger question, where does race fit into the construction of modern identity? I'm very much looking forward to see how Thomas gets at that question in his book, and I'll let him take it from here. Please welcome Thomas Chatterton Williams.
Guten Abend. Thank you, Bernhard, and thank you so much, James, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight, making the trek all the way to Wannsee in the cold, dark night. And I want to especially thank the staff here at the American Academy who have gone so far out of their way to make, certainly for me, the most incredible stretch of time I've had in my professional life so far. So thank you all very much. And I also want to thank all the other fellows who make this place such an intellectually rewarding atmosphere to be in. And I want to thank the Holtzbrinck family and group for endowing this fellowship. It's really important to have these things available to nonfiction writers. There's not so many that are this generous. So thank you very much. I'm going to read from the prologue of my work in progress, tentatively titled Self-Portrait of an Ex-Black Man. I hope the meaning of that title will become clearer by the end of the talk. But now, before I start, I just want to play a short video clip. And as it plays, I want there to be a couple of questions that hang in the air for the rest of the talk. What kind of person is this anyway? And what kind of assumptions about who she is and where she comes from do we project on her on the basis of a handful of physical characteristics and nothing else? In October 2013, after a late dinner with visiting American friends, my wife's water broke. In a daze of elation, Valentine and I did what we'd planned for weeks and woke our brother-in-law, who gamely drove us from our apartment in the northern 9th arrondissement of Paris to the Maternité, all the way on the city's southern edge. At 2 in the morning, we had the streets practically to ourselves, and the route Steve took, down the hill from our apartment, beneath the greened copper and gold of the Opera House, and through the splendor of the Louvre's courtyard, with its pyramids of glass and meticulous gardens, over the Seine, with Notre Dame rising in the distance on one side, and the Grand Palais and the Eiffel Tower shimmering on the other, and down the wide, leafy boulevards Saint-Germain and Raspail, into Montparnasse, through that neon intersection of cafes from the pages of A Movable Feast. It was unspeakably gorgeous. I'm not permanently awake to Paris's beauty, or even its strangeness, but that night, watching the city flit by my window, it did strike me that such a place, both glorious and fundamentally not mine, would be my daughter's hometown. Another 24 hours elapsed before Marlow arrived. When Valentine finally went into labor, even I was delirious with fatigue, sustained by raw emotion alone and thinking incoherently at best. On the fourth or fifth push, I caught a snippet of the doctor's rapid-fire French, something, 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 tête dorée. It took my sluggish mind a moment to register and sort the sounds, and then it hit me that she was looking at my daughter's head and reporting back that it was blonde. The rest is the usual blur. I caught a sight of a tray of placenta, heard a brand new scream, and almost fainted. The nurse whisked away my child, the doctor saw to my wife, and I was left to wander the empty corridor until I found the men's room, where I shut myself and wept like all the other newborns on the floor. I mean newborn literally. Alongside all of the other realizations of new and daunting responsibilities of advancing age, I was aware too, however vaguely, that whatever identity I had previously inhabited, I had now crossed into something new and different. When finally I'd washed my face and returned to meet my child, she was having amniotic fluid vacuumed out of her stomach. I sat beside my wife and helplessly watched our baby struggle into existence. Once she was safe, the nurse passed her to us, and she squinted open a pair of inky blue irises that I knew even then would lighten considerably but would never turn brown. For this precious being grasping for milk and breath, I felt the first throb of what has been every minute since then the sincerest love I know. And I also felt something akin to the fear of death electrify me to the core. "What have you done?" the voice of my superego demanded from some distant region of my mind, well beyond conscious control. "What have you done?" I willed it to silence. An hour or so later, when Valentine and the baby were asleep for the night, I fell into a taxi, my own brown eyes absent-mindedly retracing that beautiful and alien route. I have spent my whole life earnestly believing the American dictum that a single drop of black blood makes a person black, solely because they can never be white. Before my daughter Marlow was born that night in Paris, I'd never remotely questioned the idea that, when the time came to have them, my children would be black like me. They would be mixed, yes, but that's a matter of degree for all of us. As far as I was concerned, they'd be as black as Frederick Douglass or W.E.B. Du Bois, Lenny Kravitz or Halle Berry. Blackness as an either-or truth was so fundamental to my self-conception that I'd never rigorously reflected on its foundations. My own father, whom we call Pappy, in a nod to his southern roots, is a red-brown man. Despite a dusting of freckles under the eyes and a prominent, in my mother's words, Indian nose, no one has ever described him as anything other than black. His appearance, along with the strength of his persona, left me confident that the Williams family identity would forever be in his image. Even though my mother is unambiguously white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and descended on all sides from Northern European Protestant stock. When my father was my baby's age, there were still horse-drawn buggies and outhouses where he lived. That was in the 1930s in Galveston, a short sliver of an island in the Gulf of Mexico that bears the deplorable distinction of having been the very last place in the entire United States of America to free its slaves, some 2 whole years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Never a rich man, Pappy, whose own grandfather was born in the final year of chattel slavery, nonetheless leveraged an education to leapfrog several generations and get us into the kind of middle-class environment my brother and I were able to assume was normal. By the time I was born in 1981 in suburban New Jersey, my father had effectively cut off our family from whatever southern black roots we might have had. My brother and I were raised in a small but gloriously book-filled house with loving and devoted parents who kept few photographs or clues to the past and valorized individuality, cultivation, and self-creation over membership in any particular lineage or clan. We did not belong to any collectives. My mother is a devout Christian, but her faith was a private matter. My father is constitutionally allergic to the willed snobbishness of black social organizations like Jack and Jill, just as he and my mother wanted nothing to do with their white equivalents. As a foursome, we were an island unto ourselves in the de facto segregated town whose white side we lived on as a form of silent protest. Yet we also never questioned that ours was an unequivocally black household. Sometimes my father would even half jest that his wife wasn't really white at all. She was just light-skinned. He'd laugh. He really would. Once when I was 10 or so, I pressed him on this. "Come on," I said, "you don't really believe that, do you?" "Well, she's got black consciousness, doesn't she?" was all he'd say. It strikes me now as an adult that this exchange could occur really nowhere else but in the United States. And yet it made a certain kind of sense to me then. What I know is that my parents tried to prepare my brother and me for the reality beyond their door as best they could, by confidently and proudly proclaiming and championing our blackness so that in turn we might do the same. Beyond that door, however, and from a very young age, it became clear to me that no matter her consciousness, others would insist on perceiving differences between my mother and me. In my earliest memory of this rift, we were in the checkout line at ShopRite. I must have been 4 years old, horsing around obnoxiously with my brother. Mom, who was trying hard to count out her cash and coupons in peace, wheeled around and commanded us both to be still. When she finished the scolding, an older white woman who had been watching leaned over and whispered sympathetically, "It must be so tough adopting those kids from the ghetto." In the 80s and for a good portion of the 90s, even in a New Jersey suburb within commuting distance from Manhattan, we were a family that drew stares when we ventured out to Red Lobster. And though I did know and go to school with a number of black children in possession of all manner of skin tones and hair textures, I was unaware of anyone who consciously defined themselves as biracial until I arrived at Georgetown University in 1999. For that matter, there wouldn't even be the option to select more than one race on the national census until the turn of the millennium. Which is simply to say I'm old enough to understand why even many blacks still wax nostalgic for segregated days. There's a safety and a comfort in easy unity and acceptance, even when that unity is organized around artificial and sometimes contradictory lines. In 2012, a year before Valentine got pregnant, I published a controversial essay in the New York Times defining my future children as unassailably black. In retrospect, I can see it was a defiant last gasp of something, some way of looking at the world that I must have anticipated was under dire threat. At the time, though, I was certain I was in the right, and even prevailed on my wife to accept the same view, which was completely foreign to her European mind. Today, I wince when I read that op-ed. Parenthood changes everyone, but looking back on it now, I can say without exaggeration that I walked into the delivery room as one person and came out altogether a different man. The sight of this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and possibly fair-skinned child shocked me, along with the knowledge that she was indubitably mine. On some deeply irrational but viscerally persuasive level, I think I feared that, like a modern Oedipus, I'd metaphorically slept with my white mother, and killed my black dad. The reality of Marlow's appearance had rendered my previous one-drop stance ridiculous in my own eyes. When I look at my daughter now, I see another facet of myself. But I also know that most people who meet her will call her white. And I can't help but wonder if I've nudged my family across a threshold, the full consequences of which I may or may not even fully discern in my own lifetime. The day after Marlow was born, Nicolas, my jovial father-in-law, brought me to the nearest town hall to register and name my child. In France, this formality must be completed within the first 3 days of birth, and so in practice remains a paternal prerogative. Nick joked that I might as well take the opportunity to name her whatever I wanted. Did I have any second thoughts? He laughed. I recall that this was precisely how my brother-in-law Steve had ended up Steve and not Marcel, a fit of creative fancy having overtaken his own father, as his mother recuperated. I understood the temptation. A part of me was seized by the desire to scribble down Jemima or even Shaniqua on that official blue paper of the République Française, a nominal but glorious middle finger to the middle-class black notions of respectability I'd grown up with, as well as a subversion of any apparent whiteness, an amusing reappropriation, perhaps even a transcendence of lingering ethnic stigma. I had half-seriously floated the notion to Valentine when she first got pregnant, and let it go soon after she replied that it was impossible. Our baby's coloring had reawakened the desire for rebellion in me, but a child's life is not a sarcastic or even a political gesture. I carefully scrawled Marlow in the space allotted for prénom, just as we'd agreed. And this was itself the somewhat ironic consequence of our mutual love for the HBO series The Wire, coupled with a more practical need to find a combination of syllables that would be pronounceable in English and French. Not all French people have middle names, but it seemed necessary to me that Marlow have one and that it carry some weight. So I also wrote down Cora in tribute to my father's beloved grandmother, a member of the first generation of her line to be born into emancipation. It would later be impressed on me that Cora is the name of a chain of big box stores in France, and that to most French people's ears it sounds like Walmart. This would be my first, though not my last, lesson in the incommunicability of meaning and significance between the various realities that Marlow will have to straddle. Valentine spent a generous 6 days and nights in a private room, courtesy of the French state, before we bundled Marlow in blankets and brought her home. I had put some thought into what ought to be the first song she would ever hear in that inaugural ride, that first parental stab at cultural indoctrination, and finally settled on Mushaboom by Feist. And we'll collect the moments one by one, her soft voice flitted around the car. I guess that's how the future's done. It is by no means a black song, and that had caused me some anxiety too. There was that internal voice again, what's wrong with Stevie Wonder? But anxiety is only a fraction of what I felt. Every moment with Marlow rendered the nagging questions and the silly terrors more and more beside the point. The three of us settled in at home and friends and family. French, American, Jewish, Gentile, black and white, filled the walls with gifts and love. Son Pappy chuckled warmly while cradling Marlow in his arms for the first time when he and my mother visited a few weeks later. She's just a palomino. There was, and there still is, something very comforting to me in his brand of assurance. It's certainly true that in his day and in his fading Texas lexicon, black people could be utterly unflappable when presented with all kinds of improbable mélanges, employing a near infinitude of esoteric terms, not infrequently drawn from the world of horse breeding, which can sound jarring to the contemporary ear. I myself had to whip out my iPhone and Google Palomino. It's a pale golden or tan-colored horse with a white mane and tail, originally bred in the southwestern US. But I'd also grown up with other vocabulary, like high yellow, mulatto, and in my father's house, if nowhere else, those now anachronistic and tainted terms, quadroon and octoroon. What bizarre words these are, but what a perfectly simple reality they labor to conceal and contain. When you get all the way down to it, what all these elaborate, nebulous descriptors really signify is nothing more complicated than that in the United States in the not-so-distant past, if she did not willfully break away from her family and try her luck at passing for white, Marlow, blue eyes and all, would have been disenfranchised and subjugated like the rest of us. The wisdom, discipline, and brilliant style of American blackness would have also been her birthright too. And so there was for a long time something that could be understood as a more or less genuinely unified black experience, not without its terrible hardships, but conversely rife with profound satisfactions, which had nothing or very close to nothing to do with strict genetics. Indeed, even though the absurdity of race is always clearest at the margins, my daughter's case wouldn't have even been marginal. It wouldn't have even been considered marginal in the former slave states where theories about hypodescent were most maniacally observed, and a person with as undetectable an amount as 1/32 black blood could be legally designated colored. Which is only to say, despite all of the horrifically cruel implications of the so-called one-drop laws, until relatively quite recently, there was a space reserved for someone like Marlow, fully within the idea of what used to be called the American Negro. But it's not hard to notice that impulse toward unquestioning inclusiveness as a fully justifiable and admirable reaction to exclusiveness is going in an increasing number of precincts wherever it is that terms like Negro go to retire. The reason has less to do with black people suddenly forgetting their paradoxical origins than with the idea of whiteness continually growing, however reluctantly, less exclusive, with greater than a third of the American population now reporting at least one family member of a different race, and with, since 2000, the option to select any combination of races on the census form. The very idea of black Americans as a fundamentally mulatto population is fraying at the seams. Perhaps then mine is the last American generation for which the logic and illogic of racial classifications could so easily contradict or just gloss over the physical protestations and nuances of the body and face, which is one of the reasons it did initially take me by such surprise to find so many recessive traits flourishing in my daughter. I was being forced to confront a truth I had, if not forgotten, certainly lost sight of for some time. My daughter does not, as so many well-meaning strangers and friends tend to put it, just get those big blue eyes from her mom. But despite the length and narrowness of my own nose and the beige of my skin, I've always only been able to see a black man in the mirror staring back. Marlow's life, I now could grasp, would not be lived on my terms. But since newborns require only joy and care, not judgment, and since there were many more pressing and practical concerns animating my household in those early innocent months, there's no exaggeration to say that while I was never unaware of it, it wasn't until later that I began paying close attention, again, to the way my daughter looked. When she was a rosy-cheeked, tow-headed 4-month-old, I took Marlow on our first father-daughter excursion. It was a big deal for me. Her mother had just returned to work and was no longer breastfeeding, and I had never assumed so much responsibility before. Equipped with a fluffy bag of the requisite baby paraphernalia, we set off from our apartment to the Gare Saint-Lazare, where we boarded a regional train to its terminus in Deauville, a picturesque 19th century resort town on the Atlantic coast in Normandy. During the 2-hour ride, the two of us dozed and ate, and I gazed at my daughter in paternal awe. I was still learning her face, locating in its singularity what seemed like dimples from maman, a pair of wide, laughing eyes, maybe even from me, and a newfound grimace, awkwardly beguiling, which was hers alone. Steve came to meet our train. Marlow and I would spend a few days with him and his son Jojo in the country to give our wives some respite and to drink bottles of his parents' Burgundy by the fire once the children were in bed. A perfect French idol as far as I'm concerned. Steve comes from a family of chocolatiers. We bundled into his car and along the way stopped in the town center to see their newest shop. He also wanted to introduce his niece to his siblings who were supervising the opening of the store. I lifted my daughter in my arms and carried her inside, filled with that incommunicable pride that comes with the simple feat of parenthood. I passed the baby around and helped myself to some candy. By then I'd become aware that Marlow's hardly mixed looks could strike some people as anticlimactic, or worse, please them excessively, both reactions that leave me ill at ease. Family and close friends like Steve, on some level, intuit this, which is why it caught me like an errant elbow when his sister, certainly not intending harm and simply voicing what others must have thought, picked up Marlow and exclaimed, "Wow, but were you even in the room, or did Valentine just reproduce herself?" I laughed, and Steve made a diplomatic remark about the similarity of our personalities, but when we climbed back in the car, and I studied Marlow's face for traces of myself, which I did find there, and I wondered why these remained so inscrutable to everyone else. A quarter hour down the road from where Steve and I were headed is Valentine's grandmother's home, where 2 years prior we'd been married. Before the ceremony, I remember strolling across the property with my father, just the two of us. He was handsome in his formal suit. We stopped beneath an apple tree overlooking 2 carp ponds and the neighboring cow pastures and the little Norman outbuildings all over the house, all over the lawn, with their dark columns and white plaster walls, little gingerbread houses that epitomize all kinds of things that we are not. My father turned to me, and his expression was tender, and I think also somewhat grave, and told me, "Son, don't lose yourself." He wasn't scolding me, and he wasn't stern. He seemed almost to be imploring me, or perhaps not even addressing me at all, but speaking through me to some younger him. I'm not sure. We were interrupted shortly after, and I had to step away. We never resumed that conversation, but his words will come back to me and still come back to me and only grow louder with each passing year. Several years before, it would not have occurred to him to say something like that to me. My situation looked very different from the outside now, though from the inside it is difficult to locate the decisive moment at which your life becomes what it will be, to sift from the mound of experiences that single grain, or even that fistful of sand that shattered the back of one identity to clear the way for the next. I couldn't say when it happened to me, but one day I realized that I am constantly in rooms where not a single other soul is black. At times, in a twist that I think is extraordinary for an African American, race recedes from my lived experience and becomes something wholly cerebral, tremendously abstract. In going about getting my daily bread and making chit-chat with the baker, or rattling off the few Italian phrases I've been able to pick up over the years with the amiable grocer from Torino, I can forget about my racial categorization entirely, a sense of existential levity I don't believe my father has ever known. In any event, it doesn't last. Some inner mechanism tends to yank me back, and I'm aware that the room is white. And I realize, too, that I have grown very comfortable in these rooms, though I don't feel myself to be white. Then I look at my daughter and I wonder, in all of these white rooms that she is being brought up in, what will she learn to think of herself? Will she develop my ancestral GPS, or will that signal fade? Would it even be right for me to transmit my habits of orientation, some of which are riddled with guilt and steeped in illusion, to her untroubled head? Here, I just want to show a few more images to put what I'm talking about in context, and also, it's tough to just listen to words. So these are my parents. It must be the 70s because of the pants. If the picture were, they flare out at the bottom. This is my mother's family. My mother she'll kill me for this. She's on the left, she's like 13. And that's her mother, Esther, who grew up in Baltimore speaking German to her immigrant parents. That's my mother and I. It must be like 5 or 6, and she would have been using Afro sheen on my hair. My parents really did, they raised us as though races were singular categorizations and we were black, and that was it, and we just didn't really think about it very much. That's my wife at her grandmother's property in Normandy on our wedding day. That's us on wedding day. That's my dad right before teaching me the word palomino in Paris. That's the two grandmothers. My mom's on the right, Valentine's on the left with Marlow. My brother's wife, Marina, is from West Siberia. So that's my only sibling. So that's my brother's daughter, Mila, and that's my brother, Clarence. She's a little bit tanner than Marlow. This is the two of them together in the south of France. This is Marlow with one of her white friends who is much swarthier than her, actually. That's my dad and Mila. And he has told me, and he continues to say, that he's from the South and he's always grown up with black girls who looked like this. So he doesn't see it as a big shock. And Marlow, I realize, will come to a point where she decides who she is and it will be out of my hands. So that's something that's both thrilling and terrifying to me. And just a little bit more reading. I'm sorry. Over the course of that stay in Normandy with Steve, I took dozens, perhaps even hundreds of photos of Marlow with my phone, as she dozed on my bed or stared at the horses grazing on the lawn, as we drove to the beach, not far at all from where her great-grandfather, on my mother's side, who never fully acclimated himself to the idea of his black progeny, would have made landfall in '45 on his way to liberating concentration camps in Germany. In the pictures I took of my daughter, I found myself applying filters that made her skin tone darker. I erased shots that looked too washed out, overexposed. Out of many, I found one in which she appeared almost ecru, and this I forwarded to friends. If I felt strange conspiring to manage my daughter's looks, I was also pleased and even relieved to have visual testimony that she is, however faintly, black. And this photograph, along with a battered but still obedient adherence to the one-drop rule and conviction that Steve's family, like so many non-Americans, simply don't know the greater truth, brought me several more months of unexamined life. There's another image of my daughter that I keep at my apartment in Paris and often return to as I write. In this one, she's 20 months and seated on a large green couch in the house my brother has rented for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. Next to her is his 10-month-old half-Russian daughter, Mila. In the picture, the two cousins are staring at each other, smiling. To the right of Mila, half obscured by the teddy bear she's hugging, sits the life-sized ebony baby doll my mother has given to Marlow. It is tucked in the corner, either an afterthought or a reminder, its wide brown, unblinking eyes peering over the bear and staring straight into my lens. The image conveys to me a wry question. Which of these is a real black baby and which is artificial? I'm not always able to answer. And yet, if I linger on the image longer, stare a little bit, another memory surfaces. The way we filled that house with Pappy's heritage, Bobby Blue Bland and Syl Johnson, John Coltrane and Nina Simone. The way these sounds stir Marlow from the couch and induce her to bop rapturously to the beat. These are also her sounds if she wants them. When she bops a little too close to the stairs, I witness my 78-year-old father shed years from his age and pounds from his arthritic frame to explode from the dinner table like a sprinter out of the block, faster than Valentine can move from the kitchen, indeed faster than I find myself moving, and grab his granddaughter before she has had the chance to fall. He pulls her to him and she laughs. They have the same smile. Later that evening, Pappy will tell me again, as he told me while he was holding Marlow in Paris, that he could see no incongruity between the appearances of these girls and what anybody else might call being black. Some of his classmates in his segregated Texas schools looked like them. It has always been this way, he insists. The notion of the other is false. False or not, though, Marlow's birth and presence in my life upended my sense of myself and gave me a closer glimpse of the fluidity of racial borders than most people ever have to consider, if only because social custom tends to keep the vast majority of us so far away from the dangerous edges. The distance allows us to resort to metaphors without the risk of cognitive dissonance that necessarily attaches to a statement like, my father is black, but my daughter is white. What does a black face even look like? I used to try, and if I'm honest, sometimes still catch myself trying to answer that question. But any fool can see that the white people are not really white and that black people are not black, the writer Albert Murray was fond of pointing out. It's an observation so basic and obviously true that it's almost impossible to take seriously, like insisting that the sun does not, in fact, rise or set. But what does it say about us that the most common means we have to describe ourselves rely on categories that do not and cannot manifest on human flesh? John Locke observed that categories are made by the mind and not by nature. How indeed can you learn to look at yourself in the mirror and actually see what's there without the background noise of prejudice and myth? I can think of very few things that I have ever tried to do that have been harder. I don't think I'm alone at this either. After all these generations and centuries of practice, we still don't know how to see and talk about ourselves or each other. We are at the same time obsessed with race and wholly confounded by it. As our memories of the first black presidency congeal, I must, like you, perform some slight rhetorical legerdemain every time I define the Obama administration as such. It's very difficult to recall that it was the first openly part African-descended presidency. It's not only that such a formulation would be awfully disappointing, it's also that we viscerally believe in our boxes and don't really know or want to know how to let a person stand in two or more at the same time. This is why in America and in no other country that I'm aware of, we produce black presidents like Barack Hussein Obama, black activists like the blue-eyed star of Grey's Anatomy, Jesse Williams, and the football martyr, Colin Kaepernick, and black and virtually white-skinned NAACP leaders like Benjamin Jealous and Walter White before him. The example of Walter White resonates with me in particular. Pale-skinned, blue-eyed, and blonde-haired, he could be the male version of Marlow. Many Negroes are judged as whites, he wrote in his 1948 autobiography, A Man Called White. Every year, approximately 12,000 white-skinned Negroes disappear, people whose absence cannot be explained by death or immigration. It has always been this way, I can hear my father say. Still, we rush into our boxes, sealing them around ourselves. The idea that the boxes we sort ourselves into are not and have never been real is another question altogether, one we sometimes pay rote lip service to, but haven't come to terms with on the level of conviction. We are a nation content to live in a state of collective bad faith, like Sartre's coquette on the bench, willingly misinterpreting the evidence presenting itself, refusing to draw the implied conclusions. The worst thing one can do with words is to surrender to them. George Orwell said that. And yet surrender we do it every day. Black, white, mixed, person of color, all of us live under the weight of these labels, even those of us whose existence can't help but defy them. In color theory, there is no such thing as white. It exists solely in our perception of the world, not as a color per se, but as the absence of such. In real life, too, the lived experience of whiteness is often constructed as the absence of racial identity. It is the neutral starting point from which all else constitutes a deviation. A drop of black blood makes a person black because they are disqualified from being white. Blackness, on the other hand, is color at its most concentrated. Yet it, too, is meaningless outside the presence of white. The blackness of TypeScript doesn't mean that the letters are actually black, notes the Japanese graphic designer Kenya Hara. They merely appear black in contrast to a white sheet of paper. I do not appear black to my own daughter because she has not yet learned how to draw the necessary contrasts. As I write, she is almost 4, and I have told her I am what we call black, but this has not convinced her. You are beige, she tells me. She is not colorblind. She recognizes that her Papi de Paris, her French granddad, is what we call white. Though when he has had some wine, she astutely points out that he is actually rose or pink. And she grasps that her Papi de New York, or her American granddad, is brown, as she naively or shrewdly puts it. These are obvious facts of being she accepts with equal indifference. In addition, she knows and accepts that her mother is called white. And when she looks in the mirror at her big blue eyes and cloud of blonde curls, I can only conclude that she believes that she is the same, no matter how many If I Had a Dinosaur books I read to her with black protagonists. I have a few. These are some of the reasons that in the fall of 2016 I finally went ahead, after years of equivocating, and ordered a kit to test my DNA. To speak about a thing clearly, you must first be able to name it. To speak about yourself, you must first be able to assemble a sense of origin. For descendants of slaves, this has proved one of the most precious losses of self-knowledge that we've endured. The black experience in the South is tantamount to the biblical flood. We've stumbled off of the ark without an inkling of what things were like before it. Without genetic testing, we wouldn't be able to say with confidence from which country, let alone linguistic community or tribe, we were uprooted. In this country, we've become homogenized into something totally new. But even whites in the United States have a way of dissolving into each other, shrugging off anything resembling ethnic specificity. My mother's mother grew up speaking German to her immigrant parents in Baltimore. But as so often happens, the old world was the last thing on anybody's mind by the time her daughter was bronzing her shoulders on the beaches of Southern California. I have lived most of my life in America, 7 significant years in Western Europe, mostly France, some months in South America, and I've traveled often and extensively as far east as Moscow. But I have never set foot in Africa below Morocco. I write this now in Berlin, a tab on my laptop displaying a pastel pie chart of my particular ancestral makeup. I scrutinize the color-coded slices for meaning. That fuchsia sub-Saharan slice is markedly less than half, 39.9% of the pie. Though that is where my most recent non-American ancestor came from, sometime between 1830 and 1890. The marine blue European section, on the other hand, comprises almost 60% of the circle. This surprised me, though it should not have. As far back as 1970, some 24% of white Americans, a figure nearly double the black population at the time, had some African ancestry, often without knowing it, the result of some sneaky predecessor successfully having slipped away. But that was not the case in my mother's family. My aunt came back 99.9% Northern European. Presuming she and my mother share all ancestors, that would put my father at just under 80%, right on average, as it happens, for the population of Americans we call monoracially black. The results also let me know I do not have Alzheimer's trait. I'm relieved as my mind turns to my beloved maternal grandmother, ravaged by dementia to the point she smiled shyly, saying, "Hi, I'm Esther," the last time I saw her over a seafood dinner in San Diego. She had forgotten her own daughter's name, but not that German she grew up speaking in her parents' house. This aspect of her identity my mother marvels. She held on to completely, tenaciously even. Were I to endure a similar fate, I wonder what would be the essence that I would hold on to and revert to. I close the tab. A pie chart will not tell me who or what I am. My daughter's identity reflects back at me and changes me, not just down the line, but today, in the present. I would be another person if my wife were Japanese, and I would be another person still if she were Puerto Rican. Is this not why groups like the aristocracy fought so hard to maintain the boundaries of lineage? They knew that human beings are malleable and fleeting things. I want to suggest that one becomes one's children and grandchildren every bit as much as one carries within herself one's parents and grandparents. I want to say that I will no longer enter into the all-American skin game. And it is a game, not in the sense of entertainment, but in the sense of game theory, a veritable prisoner's dilemma in which we are all trapped, though highly unlikely to escape, since self-interest mixed with ignorance of each other's intentions practically ensures we will make the wrong choice. Still, I no longer wish to be complicit. I'm going to take a gamble and walk away, the incomprehensible round of the genetic pie chart still glowing on the backs of my eyelids when I close them. Self-Portrait of an Ex-Black Man will be the story of my American family's multi-generational transformation from what is called black to what is assumed to be white. I chose this admittedly provocative title not because I am no longer black or because my daughter now is white, but because these categories cannot adequately capture either of us or anyone else for that matter. Thank you.
Thomas, in that VQR essay you wrote, you start off with this, you start off describing the Theseus' paradox, right? And Theseus' paradox is, it's basically, can you describe it shortly?
Yeah. The ship of Theseus, or Theseus' paradox, is an image that has always stuck in my mind since my daughter was born. There's a philosophical problem that says, the king of Athens kept a big wooden ship docked in the Athenian harbor, and over time, plank by plank, it had to be repaired, and a new plank was substituted for an old rotting plank. And at some point, all the planks had been replaced. It looked like the same ship, but was it in fact the same ship, or was it a new and different ship? And that metaphor has kind of been a way of me thinking about, my brother and I have daughters, and depending on how they make choices in their lives, the choices my brother and I have made are built upon previous choices my father made, but depending on how all of these choices add up, all of these planks get substituted, it's still the same family, but will it be a new and different ship? And I often, it was a black ship not so long ago. What will it be like when it looks a different color? So that image was in my mind as I started writing this essay from which my book is being expanded.
You basically answered the question, yeah, so. Does anybody have any questions?
I think I saw one all the way back there.
Thank Thank you for a fascinating talk. I want to ask, you framed very much your transformation of thinking about race in terms of the birth of your daughter, but also in the background here is, of course, you going to France. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, in France, ways of talking about belonging in society and the way in which race is assimilated into French society is very Republican. It's a myth. I think there's a real problem with difference between the theory of republicanism in France and actually how people can become French. But it's like there's a long lineage of black Americans who have come to France. I'm thinking about Baldwin. I'm thinking of who have found it necessary to go abroad, to go to France, in order to separate themselves from the debate at home, in order to see things differently. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, framing the story perhaps in terms of France, rather than framing it in terms of the birth of your daughter, if it can be told that way.
That's a great question. It was liberating for many black GIs and black artists to find themselves in Europe after the war. Some stayed in Germany too, or a lot went to Paris. It was liberating because it was the first time in many of their lives where they were encountered as, first and foremost, as American and not as black. And so many black Americans may not have had that experience in the States where they were first and foremost black and not American. It was a secondary identity. And so that's a very liberating experience to be black in Europe and to be black in Paris. I myself, part of why I go long stretches at a time without thinking about race outside of my professional capacity is because in France, I'm just treated as an American. In that country, like I believe it works here, they don't even officially count people's race or ethnicity. Everybody, if you're a citizen, you're just French. So, you know, this leads to all types of problems. Like prisons are disproportionately Arab and African, but everyone in prison is just a Frenchman. So there's no discrepancy in justice. And in France, people are not devoid of prejudice, but their prejudices don't exactly apply to me. And they don't often apply to many Americans. So it's a different dynamic. Oftentimes, the prejudices have to do with origins or religion, or if you come from, you know, a former colony or not. So these are aspects of why it was very interesting for my wife to try to figure out and to start to understand the way that Americans construct race, because America is a very skin-obsessed society. In Europe, you know, for whatever problems Europe may have, it doesn't tend to be as obsessed with skin and with mixing the same way. And that makes sense because it wasn't a society in which slaves were held in the European countries. So there wasn't this fear of a loss of oneself, of falling into a lower caste the same way. So you could have situations where you had Alexandre Dumas, and you had mixed people going far back in France who were just basically able to live a life they wouldn't have been able to live in the United States at the time. So we've kind of been figuring out our own family's racial identity that would be different, I think, if we were a family who had always lived in the United States. It's a question I'm still trying to answer in the book.
Hello, thank you for the reading. It was very, very interesting hearing your prologue. My question kind of relates to how gender intersects with race, in that you have a daughter that presents as white. And I don't know if you're having more children, but would there be a difference if you have a son that also presents as white? And given that I know that for many African American men, the education that you get in America is very focused on that intersection of being a male and being black. And is it something that you and your wife have thought about? How does that kind of affect you, or what have you thought about that?
Thank you. That's a very astute question, something that I have thought about a lot, actually. It's very much easier with a girl, I think. I have some friends who have, are in similar situations with the racial composition of their couple, and they have, it's a different dynamic with a male child. Oftentimes because of the way that black masculinity is fraught with so many issues, and the way that the way that I was raised by, black-white relationships tend to be black man, white woman, especially in the United States. Very, very much fewer are a black woman, white man. So usually the male is black. And so if I was raising a boy who looked like my daughter, he would have a very different, I mean, he would even have a very different passage through society than I have. I have a pretty easy time at it, I think, but people don't think I'm white. But if I had a son who looked like Marlow, he could simply walk through society in a way that I can't 100% relate to, you know? And it might be just fine, and maybe it wouldn't actually be, maybe there would be no more psychological challenge than there has been with my daughter, which actually hasn't been that challenging because you just love your family. But it is something that I've thought a lot about, and I'll be able to answer that more fully if I cross that bridge.
Well, thank you, Thomas. And just to explain, we've met in New York in 2006, so I've kind of seen that progression from talking very proudly about being an African American or black gentleman to now being, you know, a white guy in a way.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
I'm just being provocative here. No, but what do you think your family will lose in terms of their identity if this next generation identifies as being white?
It's interesting. I mean, the person who is the least anxious about that is my dad, because he's one of the first people I ever heard say that race is an illusion. I mean, he was saying that to me when I was really young, and he really believes that. Actually, you know, it hasn't been an illusion in his life. It's been a very real factor of his life. It's harmed him in measurable ways, but it didn't make him believe in it anymore. And so he thinks, you know, are the kids healthy? Like, you know, are they loved? You know, are they aware of, you know? I think he'd be bothered if we were having a situation, as some families have done historically and continue to do, where you pass out of, the bargain you strike is that your kids no longer have anything to do with their black ancestors, their black family. I mean, people do that still. I think that would bother him tremendously, but so long as as long as the family is a real family, I mean, all of my wife's family, they make no fuss over it. My father makes no fuss over it. I think that in our case, I don't think that, you know, I'm more the person that has thought about this more than anyone else.
What do you feel you're losing? Because you had that piece of identity in there, and so if that is lost in the next one, what are you trying to cling on to, I guess?
What I'm worried about, I think the closest parallel I've seen is with certain secular Jews that I've known, where they marry a Christian or something, and then there's a fear that somehow when you come from people that have suffered, there's this fear that you're not honoring the debt. That's why I say, I was reading, you know, I'm saying, is it even right if I transmit some types of ancestral guilt that I have that I can't get out of my mind to my daughter? Like, is that something is that a good thing to pass on? I don't know, actually. But I know that sense of guilt is real, it's powerful, and it's, are you making decisions in your life because you're feeling hobbled to generations past? Is that what they would even want? I really don't know. These are things that I'm trying to work through still.
Thanks, Thomas. I mean, I guess piggybacking off that, I have a couple different thoughts. One being, instead of thinking of blackness just as something guilty, or in a way of like, you know, sort of your ancestors are sort of guilting you into being it, aren't there ways to be proud of being black in like 2017 that have nothing to do with guilt, nothing to do with slavery, nothing to do with any of that?
Thank you for prompting that clarification. I'm really proud to be black, and what I think of as blackness is coming more from like a Ralph Ellison, Albert Murray understanding now, which I think is what most of us are talking about when we're talking about race of any type, which is ethnicity and culture, more than anything having to do with strict genetic pie charts. And so I'm very proud of that, and I think culturally that is something that I intend to transmit. And you know, that works. That does tend to work in some similar situations with secular Jews who have married outside of their race.
I think I got the main thing or question slash comment. Michael Steinberg would be very mad at me, I think, if I didn't make it just like a pointed question. Is I guess as a sort of like token European historian in the room, I think I want to take quibble in some ways with your characterization of Europe. And that I think, because I see it all the time, that this happens with African Americans who come to Europe and see it as better than the United States.
For Americans.
For Americans, right. But I still sort of want maybe you to reflect a little bit more on, because I experience this too, to a certain degree, sort of the relationship between race and nationality here, the ways in which as soon as I open my mouth to speak English, I'm protected by my nationality, because then people know that I'm American. But until that moment, and I'm also darker than you, right? They're not thinking that. They're thinking oftentimes when I go to archives, I'm a cleaning lady or something like that, right? So isn't there a way to acknowledge better somehow the ways in which coming to Europe, the sort of transnational move, transatlantic move, is in itself a form of power and privilege that we have that other people don't have, and that this is also like triggering part of our transformation, or the ways in which we're allowed to be more than just the sort of boxes and categories that people place us in.
I 100% agree with you. I've actually written an essay on that, and it's very much something that James Baldwin wrote a lot about. You arrive in France and suddenly like you're off the hook, and then you look around, but like someone else is in your position that you would be back in Harlem in 1945. Of course, I'm aware of that. Like there's another element of society that has nothing to do with me in Paris that fulfills a function that blacks and Latinos tend to fill in the United States of America to the extent that they do. It's an extraordinary privilege to be American and to be an American abroad anywhere, really. Still, even in this age of Trump, I'm 100% aware of that. I'm also aware that when I do go to like Morocco or something like that, I'm considered white, even though in France because race, in France people might consider me Moroccan if they don't initially understand I'm American. In Morocco they think I'm white because race is loosely tied to genetic characteristics and has a lot to do with social position and power and access to certain things. And comportment and behaviors and manners. So it's really interesting how, race, I make this point sometimes is like politics, like all race is local. Like black is not black is not black is not black, mixed is not mixed is not mixed. And so there has to be an awareness that I think it's, I don't want to be thought of as saying in a very facile way that Europe is a utopia and America is a racial hell.
Can I interject there? I think there's the one difference between Europe and the United States, tell me if you think this is maybe accurate, is that in Europe you can speak about it still in ethnic terms, like we are Germans, or we are French, or we are this, and then there's the other, and that other may be represented in different ways, whether it's from the Middle East or from Africa or whatever it is. And so therefore there may be a similar mechanism in seeing the other as in the States, as exists in the States, but it doesn't have to be in racial, it's not stated in racial terms, right? Because they don't have to. Whereas in the United States, because you have this kind of melting pot, you have this counterintuitively in a way, you have, well, then how are we going to differentiate ourselves? And you have this kind of, well, we'll do it along racial lines. And I feel like this, I feel like that's one difference between Europe and the United States, but I ask myself whether or not that difference is purely semantic and whether it has...
It depends on who you ask.
It depends, yeah.
But my students and I do debate that. I teach a class called Black Germany, right, in which we talk about blackness in a European context and German context versus in the American context. And I also sort of like play devil's advocate, and I fight them on this a lot because oftentimes I get really frustrated when they take American blackness and try to put it, like directly place it in Germany, and I'm like, well, that's not going to work in the same way. So I go back and forth on this as well, I think, but at the same time, I mean, there is something transformational about sort of coming to Europe for Black Americans anyway, And then I think perhaps another way of thinking about it, this might be a sort of different approach, would be talking to people who are sort of African descent in Europe about their first times going to the United States. Because that does exist in different memoirs that I'm thinking of, where sort of people who are Afro-German or French or whatever sort of then end up in the United States and then end up getting recategorized.
I have some friends like that who have found the reverse kind of liberation. Yeah. There's liberation in being a foreigner sometimes. Yeah.
The last thing I was going to suggest is the book by Michelle Wright called The Physics of Blackness, which I think in a lot of ways is what you're talking about, which is about, instead of asking what is blackness, she asks, well, instead it's better to think about where is blackness and when is blackness. That sort of thinking about it in these ways gets to the sort of specificity that I think you want to get at, because she also is sort of like, it's ridiculous to think of this as monolithic, as opposed to thinking of it in sort of more, again, she employs sort of the logics of physics to think about sort of where and when it's located.
Thank you.
This isn't my question, but I will observe that a lot of my Black European friends, male friends, are like, they all have experiences in Berlin of having been asked whether they were drug dealers. It's a very frequent occurrence here. But my question is, do you anticipate finding this uncomfortable popularity again amongst white conservatives with this book that was mentioned before?
Yeah, well, I'm not even sure if this is anymore. That's like something that it's really hard to anticipate, but some probably would agree with me, but they might be, I don't think that like liberals or Democrats have all of the answers and conservatives are always wrong and everything. I actually think that like the idea that like individuals have varied experiences within societies, nations, ethnic groups, classes, if that's a conservative way of understanding American life, and if the left is more interested in collective ways of understanding it, then I don't necessarily shrink back from that, because I think that, well, this is a very different conversation, but the identity politics of, I think I used to be much more thinking along the lines of identity politics when I wrote this op-ed in, I guess, 2012, saying that my kids, no matter what they look like, will be black, period. They have an ethical obligation to identify as black. I'm no longer comfortable at all with that position, but I think it would be more in line with groups like Black Lives Matter now than it would be with a conservative view of how individuals function. So I'm just trying to get at something that can transcend the kind of racial dynamics that seem so stagnant. And I don't think that like my book is going to change American race relations, but I also don't think that we can ever really transcend racism so long as you and I really believe in genetic color categories of human race that make you one thing and me halfway between you and someone else, Can
I ask a question following up on that last point? You're really deconstructing race as a concept, right? Or is that fair to say? Like you're questioning the realness.
Yeah, I am absolutely.
And in any case, but yet that construction has been obviously applied.
Yep.
And to devastating ends, and to and so my question is, what is the message that you're sending? I guess. Well, how will it? I mean, aside from it just perhaps being true, how does it address? How does it address that construction as it's been applied?
Well, a book that's really important, like in the evolution of the way I've been thinking about this, is called Racecraft, which is by two sisters, last name Fields. It's really, I can't believe this book hasn't been as big of a bestseller as it should have been, but it's really influential. They basically go through a very complicated argument that's very convincing about how race functions in American society, much like how witchcraft still functions in certain African cultures and used to function in like Massachusetts when they were burning witches at the stake in Salem. Like it's something that We know that witches don't exist, and it's a very real fact. It was in a society that believes in witchcraft. It's a very real aspect. It's as real as like this table. If something like witchcraft is something that we think somebody in here might have, if someone might be a witch, and it's invisible and you can't identify it. You can't tell me where blackness starts and stops in a person. There's no one characteristic that can show you why you're one place and another person is another place. So these things operate in our society, and we buy into them, we believe them, and they have very real world consequences. But there's no reason why we have to believe in race the way that we do now. So I think that the power whatever power that writing has is that it can raise awareness, but it's very difficult. I mean, even in this talk, even now that as I write, if I write an op-ed for New York Times, try talking about the way that we live now without using black or white. It's almost impossible to describe our lives without these terms. These color terms that you're not white. You're light, but you're not the color. This is white, But try talking about things. You cannot get through a conversation, or you're always in air quotes. It's really difficult. But if we all, things do change. So I'm writing just hoping that the conversation, that people become more aware. But I'm under no illusions that it's something that's going to change in my lifetime.
Hi, Thomas. So thank you for the reading and sharing your prologue with us. I was intrigued by your conclusion, how you want to just shirk off. That's not the right term. You want to kind of move away from this paradigm, right? And you want your daughter to also not have to be burdened by this paradigm. I'm wondering if you can speak more about how you think race works in terms of, and maybe people have been kind of talking about this in some respects as well already, but if, to the extent that you want to say that you're not black or white or whatever, right? When you go back to the States, is it so easy to not be black or white or whatever, since this is the society we live in, and we have I guess what I'm trying to get at is the power structure, right, that exists in the U.S., and race has huge power dynamics, and you can't ignore that. And so just because you want to not, I'm going to be kind of pushing you,
sure.
Right? So just because you don't want to be seen as black doesn't mean other people won't. And so how do you grapple with that?
Right. So this is something that's very important in the book. There's the way that you see yourself, and there's the way that society reflects your identity back at you. You can say, I can scream until I'm blue in the face that I'm Japanese, but I might be the only person that will ever believe that. And as long as none of you reflect that back to me, I have to negotiate an identity between what I want or what I see myself as and what we all agree on. So I'm under no illusions. I mean, culturally, I'm fine nothing is changing between the way I've ever been, and I would even, in many ways, still call myself black. But if we're having a serious conversation about genes and things like this, I'm no longer in this game. I'm stepping out of that. I don't think there's anything good that comes out of the way that we've been building race for the past 400, 500 years, and really that's the extent of it. So it's not the type of conversation that I'll have in the barbershop, probably, but on a deeper level, I do think that how do you stop talking about these things if nobody can get out of it? That's why I call it it's a prisoner's dilemma. It's I'm going to keep calling myself black because you're going to keep calling me black, but I don't think that is a real term anymore. Somebody's got to move, right? I want to stop using these terms, but I don't want to be held hostage by these terms. But I also don't want to be a fool and say that I'm walking down the street with my father and he can't be profiled or something. I'm not naive. I'm not trying to be naive. I think that's it. I think it's time for wine. Thank you all so much.